Hello movie barfs and welcome back to the channel. Now, despite the title of the trilogy, Thorin Oakenshield seems to be the main character of the Hobbit trilogy instead of Bilbo himself. Most of the story centers around his character, his goals, and his conflict, while Bilbo takes a backseat and is more of a side character. A small disclaimer before we move on, this video only covers Thorin's arc as it was in the films, and not in the book. Thorin is one of the best things about the Hobbit franchise. He's the closest thing we have to a pseudo-Aragorn in the series, and he has his own blend of charisma being an exiled king trying to lead his people back to their home. But he's also one of the worst things, to be honest, most notably with his character arc and how it haphazardly develops and ends. Thorin's character arc represents that of a negative arc initially, where he develops some undesirable traits with his greed, but then it ends off with a positive arc with his deathbed repentance. The trilogy started him off well. He's the grandson of Thror who was driven mad by greed and whose wealth attracted the dragon Smaug, causing everyone to have to flee from the mountain and become homeless nomads. After many years, his mission is to recover the King's Jewel, also known as the Arkenstone, which would supposedly unite the Seven Kingdoms to fight against the dragon and kick him out of the mountain. Fast forward to the end of the Desolation of Smaug, Bilbo has recovered the Arkenstone but is hesitant to hand it over to Thorin, based on Smaug's taunt that it will corrupt him and drive him mad. At this point, things start to become a bit hazy. The Arkenstone is the MacGuffin of the trilogy, but nowhere has it been established that it has the ability to corrupt the desires of those who behold it. Even for the One Ring in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, it's a bit of a stretch of imagination that a little piece of metal can be an object of lust and corruption. It's just a premise that we have to accept and move on to appreciate the rest of the films. But at least the film lets us in on it at the start so that it sinks in early. In the Hobbit trilogy, the Arkenstone being a source of corruption just comes suddenly and out of left field. But okay, so Bilbo decides to hide it from him, but the thing is, Thorin still goes mad with greed even without the Arkenstone. Instead, it just comes out of looking at the mountains of gold in the throne room. This is Thorin's negative character arc, his fall from being an honorable, selfless prince to a greedy, self-centered king. But this character arc is weak for several reasons. 1. Why did the film bother to set up the Arkenstone as a source of corruption if the gold was going to have that effect anyway? Thorin never got his hands on the Arkenstone, so it couldn't possibly have that effect on him. Secondly, it was established earlier that Thorin was determined not to fall into the greedy error of his grandfather, so it's rather inconsistent that now he's suddenly in a worse state than Thror, with an even greater obsession with gold than him. And it looks forced and fake. He enters this drunken stupor of sorts where he's enchanted and has no more will of his own, and it just looks silly. Thirdly, this negative character arc just develops suddenly with no build-up or foreshadowing. It's poorly founded and it takes us by surprise, and the excuse the film gives us is laughable. Now, in addition to the Arkenstone, it seems that the gold also has the ability to corrupt. According to Balin, it's dragon sickness, or some kind of curse that's inherent in the gold. Even Bard mentions this curse later, and as for how he knows it's cursed, it's just one of the many mysteries in this trilogy. And fourthly, this character arc was quite unnecessary. It was used to advance the plot in two ways, with Thorin spitting in the faces of the Lake Town villagers when they came to him for aid after Smaug wrecked their home, and with his selfish decision to let Dain and the other dwarves fight on his behalf while he descends into further madness. With the Lake Town villagers, the film could have just set up a negative relationship between Thorin and them in his visit there. That would make his selfishness towards them more believable rather than just being caused by this random dragon sickness. After all, he did promise to make their town prosper earlier on. Instead of having them welcoming him earlier, maybe have them treat him like crap when he passed through there so that when the tables are flipped and now they're coming to him for aid, it's easy to accept that he's giving them the cold shoulder tit for tat. As for his passivity in leaving Dain and the dwarves to fight the war alone, that was such a useless plot point. Thorin's negative character arc, his greed, just gets suddenly resolved in this scene. The one where he's just standing alone in the hall with the gold floor and he gets some hallucination where he sees the dragon swimming in the gold and he falls into it like quicksand. Then suddenly he just reaffirms his decision to not be like his grandfather and snaps out of his greed and his delusion. This character change just ends as abruptly as it began. There was nothing noteworthy to justify his sudden descent into madness and nothing to explain how he got out of it. It's a poorly developed character arc and appears to be more of a plot device to add unnecessary screen time to an already bloated movie. Fast forward to the end of the film. Thorin is now fatally wounded and about to die. Bilbo is by his side, and Thorin's concluding character arc, a positive one this time, is seen when he tells Bilbo that if more people were like him, valuing food and cheer over hoarded gold, this world would be a happier place. Touching words, no doubt, except that they don't really deal as much of an emotional impact as they could have. Again, we've seen nothing that would change Thorin's mind about his greed, except the dragon sickness quicksand scene we saw earlier. We're still scratching our heads as to what changed his values and how he's able to forgive Bilbo for his betrayal. Realistically, he would have died as the same greedy dwarf, still harboring his resentment against Bilbo to the grave. On a side note, one common criticism about the Hobbit trilogy is that Bilbo has no character arc, that he's pretty much the same person at the end of the trilogy as he was in the start. But that's how he's meant to be. His character has a flat arc where he's meant to be the same throughout, similar to characters like Indiana Jones or Joker from The Dark Knight. They stay the same from start to end. Bilbo here is an impact character where he does not change but instead changes other characters with his actions instead. And the best scene between Bilbo and Thorin for me was this one here. Bilbo is sitting down, appearing to look at something in his hand, and Thorin barges in thinking that it's the Arkenstone. Bilbo reveals that he's just holding an acorn, which he plans to plant in his own backyard to serve as a reminder of this adventure. The contrast between the two characters couldn't be clearer here. Despite being surrounded by more wealth than he'll ever need in his life, Bilbo appears to be unaffected and uninterested in it. And much to the surprise of Thorin, his prize is an object that costs nothing and is something most wouldn't even take notice of. And I feel that's exactly more of what's needed to justify Thorin's eventual change of mind, from greed to contentment. We needed more of these scenes so that when Thorin expresses his regret to Bilbo over his actions, it feels earned rather than forced, and delivers more of an emotional payoff rather than being an unmemorable death. Thorin's death was clearly meant to be the emotional crescendo of the trilogy, but when he died, I hardly felt anything, and that's such a shame. I wish they did more to develop his character and make his arc feel more natural and believable, even if it means taking some creative differences from the book and adding more interactions between him and Bilbo. But, as it stands, Thorin's poorly developed and poorly resolved character arc was an unsatisfying end to a beloved character and one of the major weak points of the Hobbit trilogy. So, what did you think, folks? What were your favorite parts or gripes with the Hobbit trilogy? Let me know in the comments below. I read all of them and will get back to most questions. And if you got anything out of this video, please help to give it a like. It only takes a second, but helps me out tremendously. Thanks for watching, folks. Subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you next time.